The grocery bag tears just as Margaret reaches her car, sending canned goods rolling across the parking lot. At 82, her arthritic hands shake as she tries to gather the scattered items, her worn Air Force pilot wings pin catching the afternoon sunlight on her faded jacket. Most shoppers walk past without a second glance, but one young man stops dead in his tracks. He's seen those wings before, and he knows exactly what they mean. What happens next will restore your faith in humanity and reveal a hidden chapter of American aviation history that most people never knew existed. Margaret Henderson steadied herself against her old sedan as canned soup and boxes of crackers scattered across the asphalt. The paper bag had given way just as she'd managed to shuffle the 20 feet from the grocery store entrance to her car, a journey that seemed to take longer each month. Her weathered hands trembled as she bent down, her back protesting with each movement. The afternoon sun was unforgiving, and sweat beaded on her forehead beneath her gray hair. She wore the same faded blue jacket she'd owned for decades, the one with the small silver wings pinned carefully to the left breast pocket. Most shoppers hurried past, focused on their own errands, their own problems. A few glanced her way with mild sympathy, but kept walking. Margaret had grown accustomed to being invisible. Just another elderly woman moving slowly through a world that had seemingly forgotten her generation. She managed to retrieve a can of green beans and a box of instant oatmeal before her knees began to buckle. The parking lot felt endless, the scattered groceries impossible to gather. Then footsteps approached, quick and purposeful. "Ma'am, please let me help you." The voice was young, respectful, with a slight southern drawl. Margaret looked up to see a man in his mid-20s, dressed in civilian clothes but scarce, wrying himself with unmistakable military bearing. His short haircut, polished shoes, and the way he immediately assessed the situation told her everything she needed to know about his background. But it was the look in his eyes that caught her attention, not pity, but something closer to recognition. Staff Sergeant David Martinez had been walking to his truck after his own grocery run when he noticed the elderly woman struggling. His first instinct was simply to help, as his grandmother had raised him to do. But as he drew closer, something made him pause. Those wings on her jacket weren't the standard military pins he was used to seeing. They were different, smaller, more delicate, but with an unmistakable authority. He'd seen them once before in a museum exhibit about World War II aviation. His pulse quickened as the realization hit him. "Ma'am," he said gently, kneeling to collect the remaining groceries. "I couldn't help but notice your wings." He gestured respectfully toward her jacket, his tone careful and reverent. "Are those wasp wings?" Margaret's eyes widened with surprise. It had been years, maybe decades, since anyone had recognized the significance of the small silver pin. Most people assumed it was just a decorative piece, perhaps a gift from a husband or son who had served. Very few understood that those wings represented her own service, her own sacrifice. She studied the young man's face, noting the genuine interest and respect in his expression. "You know about the WASP program?" she asked, her voice carrying a mixture of surprise and cautious hope. David nodded, still carefully gathering her groceries and placing them in a sturdy paper bag he'd retrieved from his own truck. "My grandfather told me stories," he said. "He was a flight instructor during the war. He said the women pilots were some of the best he'd ever seen, better than most of the men, if he was being honest." Margaret felt something shift in her chest, a warmth she hadn't experienced in years. This young man understood. He knew that her wings weren't just decorative. They represented something real, something earned through blood, sweat, and countless hours in cockpits that most people assumed were meant only for men. "I flew P-51 Mustangs," she said quietly, almost to herself. "Ferried them from the factory to the training bases. Sometimes I'd deliver 3 or 4 planes in a single day." David's respect deepened visibly. He'd flown missions over Afghanistan, knew the precision and skill required to handle military aircraft. The idea of this elderly woman, probably no more than 20 years old at the time, flying those powerful fighters across the country filled him with admiration. "Ma'am, would you mind if I helped you load these groceries? And maybe you could tell me more about your service." Margaret looked at this young serviceman. She could tell by his bearing that he was active duty, and felt a connection she hadn't experienced in decades. The Women Air Force Service Pilots program had been one of the best-kept secrets of World War II, and Margaret had been part of something extraordinary. Between 1942 and 1944, over 1,000 women had served as civilian pilots for the military, taking on dangerous missions that freed up male pilots for combat duty overseas. They flew every type of aircraft in the military inventory: fighters, bombers, transport planes, often without the safety equipment and recognition that their male counterparts received. Margaret had joined the program when she was just 19, one of the youngest accepted. She'd learned to fly on her father's crop duster in rural Nebraska, developing an intuitive feel for aircraft that impressed even the most skeptical instructors. When the call went out for women pilots, she'd been among the first to volunteer, driven by patriotism and a desire to serve her country in whatever way she could. The training had been rigorous, more demanding than what many male pilots received, because the women had to prove themselves worthy of handling military aircraft. Her first assignment had been ferrying P-51 Mustangs from the North American Aviation Factory in California to training bases across the country. These weren't pleasure flights. The Mustangs were high-performance fighters, temperamental and powerful, requiring expert skill to handle safely. Margaret had flown them through mountain ranges, across deserts, in all kinds of weather conditions. She'd navigated by dead reckoning when radio equipment failed, landed on unfamiliar airstrips in the middle of nowhere, and always delivered her aircraft in perfect condition. But the most dangerous missions had come later, when she'd been selected for target towing duty. This involved flying a twin-engine aircraft while towing fabric targets behind her plane, giving anti-aircraft gunners and fighter pilots practice with live ammunition. The margin for error was essentially zero. If the target cable snapped at the wrong moment, or if a trainee pilot misjudged his approach, Margaret could find herself in the line of fire. 38 women had died during WASP service, a sobering reminder of the real dangers they faced every day. David helped Margaret into the passenger seat of his truck, insisting on driving her home while her groceries stayed cool in his air-conditioned cab. During the short drive, she shared more stories about the camaraderie among the women pilots, the skepticism they'd faced from some male colleagues, and the pride they'd felt in serving their country. When they reached her modest apartment, David made a decision that would change both of their lives. That evening, he posted a photo on social media. Margaret sitting in his truck, her wasp wings clearly visible, with a caption that read, "Today I met a real American hero. This is Margaret Henderson, age 82, one of the women Air Force service pilots who flew military aircraft during World War II. She was struggling with her groceries, but she never complained. She just said she was grateful for the chance to serve her country. We owe our freedom to heroes like Margaret." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, the post had been shared thousands of times. Local news stations picked up the story, and Margaret's phone began ringing with interview requests. The local Air Force base reached out, wanting to invite her for a ceremony. Fellow veterans commented with their own stories of family members who had served in the WASP program. The mayor's office called to discuss a possible key to the city. Margaret was bewildered by the attention. She'd spent decades believing that her service had been forgotten, that the WASP program was just a footnote in history that no one remembered or cared about. The overwhelming response revealed something profound about how hungry people were for real heroes. Not celebrities or social media influencers, but genuine individuals who had sacrificed for something greater than themselves. Margaret's story resonated because it represented the thousands of unsung heroes from what Tom Brokaw had called the greatest generation. These were people who had stepped up during their nation's darkest hour, not for fame or recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. Margaret had never expected parades or medals. She'd simply wanted to do her part to win the war and bring the boys home safely. David found himself appointed as Margaret's unofficial liaison with the media and various organizations wanting to honor her. He coordinated interviews, helped her prepare for speaking engagements, and made sure she wasn't overwhelmed by the sudden attention. Through it all, he was struck by her humility and grace. She insisted that she was just one of many women who had served, that her story wasn't unique or special. But David understood what she couldn't see, that her willingness to serve, combined with her decades of quiet dignity, made her exactly the kind of hero America needed to remember. The centerpiece of Margaret's recognition came 3 weeks later when the local Air Force base organized a formal ceremony in her honor. The base commander, Colonel Jennifer Walsh, had read about Margaret's story and immediately wanted to pay tribute to a fellow female aviator who had paved the way for women in military aviation. The ceremony was held in the base's main hangar with current Air Force personnel, local dignitaries, and media representatives in attendance. But the most special guests were three other WASP veterans, now in their 80s and 90s, who had traveled from across the country to honor their sister pilot. Margaret walked into that hangar wearing her original WASP uniform, carefully preserved for over 70 years. The sight of her, dignified and proud in her military dress, brought tears to many eyes. Colonel Walsh presented her with a certificate of appreciation and a flag that had flown over the Pentagon. But the most emotional moment came when the other WASP veterans joined her on stage. These women, now grandmothers and great-grandmothers, had shared experiences that few people could understand. The thrill of flying military aircraft, the weight of responsibility, the pride of serving their country in an unprecedented way. As Margaret stood before the crowd, flanked by her fellow WASP veterans, she spoke about the importance of service and sacrifice. "We didn't fly those planes for recognition," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in years. "We flew them because our country needed us, and because we believed in something bigger than ourselves. I see that same spirit in the young men and women serving today, and it gives me hope for the future." She looked directly at David, who stood at attention in the front row, and smiled. Sometimes it just takes one person noticing, one person caring, to remind us that service and sacrifice still matter. The ceremony concluded with a flyover by 4 F-22 Raptors, their thunderous engines echoing through the hangar as they passed overhead in tribute to Margaret and her fellow WASP veterans. As the crowd dispersed, Margaret found herself surrounded by young Air Force personnel, eager to hear more stories about aviation history and inspired by her example of quiet heroism. She realized that her story had become something larger than her own experience. It was a bridge between generations, a reminder that the values of service, duty, and sacrifice transcend time. David drove Margaret home that evening, both of them reflecting on the day's events. "You know," Margaret said as they pulled into her driveway, "I never thought anyone would remember what we did. For the longest time, it felt like the WASP program was just a footnote in history, something that happened and then was forgotten." David shook his head. "Ma'am, heroes are never really forgotten. Sometimes it just takes the right moment, the right person, to remind everyone why your service mattered, and it did matter, more than you know." Margaret Henderson's story reminds us that heroes walk among us every day, often unrecognized and unacknowledged. The Women Air Force Service Pilots program represents one of the most remarkable chapters in American military history. Over 1,000 women who stepped forward to serve their country in an unprecedented way, flying dangerous missions with courage and professionalism that earned the respect of their male colleagues. These women didn't seek fame or recognition. They simply answered their country's call when it needed them most. Today, as we face our own challenges and uncertainties, Margaret's example reminds us of the power of quiet service and the importance of recognizing the heroes in our communities. Sometimes all it takes is one person stopping to help, one person taking the time to listen, to transform a life and honor the sacrifices that built our freedom. The next time you see an elderly veteran wearing their service pins, remember Margaret's story, and remember that behind those symbols lie tales of courage, sacrifice, and service that deserve our deepest respect and gratitude. If stories like Margaret's inspire you to learn more about the unsung heroes who shaped our nation, please subscribe for more incredible tales of service and sacrifice. These stories matter, these heroes matter, and their legacy lives on in each of us who choose to serve something greater than ourselves. Honor their memory by living with the same courage, dignity, and dedication to service that defined their generation.